Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, Embrace family, and Jazakallah here for joining us for tonight's discussion of Chapter 4 of the book, Servants of Allah, African Muslims Enslaved in the Americas by Sylviane Diouf. Last time in the first part of Chapter 4, titled Literacy, a Distinction and a Danger, we discussed how sometimes being more educated than their slave masters was a conflict with the idea of slavery, how the Muslim slaves tried to preserve their literacy, and even the availability of Quran, mashallah. So tonight, for the second part of Chapter 4, inshallah, we will discuss how the literacy of the Muslim slaves played a role in religious writings, communicating with one another, and also in the writing of their autobiographies. So when it comes to religious writing, the author shares that while some commentators consider it kufr, or an act of disbelief, there were those who created amulets, talismans, charms, things that were supposed to provide protection. She explains that this was done by writings placed and sewn within various materials like leather and cotton, and worn around the neck or around other parts of the body, and even sometimes under a woman's headdress. She shares that sometimes there would be writings put in water, and when the ink dissolved, they would actually wash with it or drink it, subhanAllah. However, the author also mentions that there were some writings like surahs that were simply, reminders for the Muslims. So one way the author mentions that these amulets were used was to encourage fighters during a rebellion. The author says, quote, "They were as vital as weapons, and by providing anti-death protection to the insurgents, the marabouts, or religious men, played a significant role in slave revolts, whatever may be thought about the efficiency of their products," she says. And as mentioned last time, since Arabic was not a common language understood by the slave masters, the plans for the Bahir Rebellion in 1835 were written and shared in Arabic. Now, when it comes to using Arabic for general communication, we usually differentiate between spoken or conversational Arabic and Quranic or classical Arabic. And interestingly, the author mentions, quote, "Though the Arabic of the Quran is a classical language, West Africans have used it to communicate for 1,000 years, mashallah." And she also explains how writing would be natural for them. In the case of Omar ibn Said, when he was jailed after running away, he was unable to communicate in English. So he wrote his plea for release on the walls of his cell in Arabic. And while no one could understand what he wrote, right, still, the fact that he could write was something that caused a stir among the locals. And even though he was sold again, the author points out that he was treated less harshly, she says, because he was literate. Now, another slave the author mentions who uses writing to improve his situation was Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. And he decided to write a letter to his father in Arabic seeking his help to become free. And while the letter did not reach his father, there were men who took notice of him along the letter's path, and one who actually freed him after having the letter translated at Oxford University. Now, the author also points out that while the writing in the language of Quran was akin to like writing in Latin, had he wrote the letter in his home language using Arabic letters, Oxford, she said, wouldn't have been able to translate it. And she says he owes his freedom to, quote, his faith and his literacy. Now, again, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo is the one we talked about before, who wrote the Quran in its entirety 3 times from memory, mashallah. Another slave, Ibrahim Abdurrahman, who was the subject of the documentary we watched on Friday, hopefully you were able to join us for that, also initially wrote a letter in Arabic to his family. His story had many twists and turns, mashallah, including getting the attention of the U.S. president at the time. And when he eventually made it back to Africa without many of his family members, he again wrote a letter to his family for money to help to free them. And they sent him $7,000 in gold, mashallah. So the author points out essentially that trying to write home to family to help become free was possible if the letters reached them. Now, a group of Muslims in Trinidad also used writing to seek passage back to Africa. So while they were free, they wrote to in English to the King and Queen of England and to the British administration, saying essentially, well, you brought us here, now send us back, right? Take us back. And while the letter was written in English, they opened Islamically and closed with Arabic signatures. So they wanted to send the message that they were educated and Muslim. Now, the Muslims who wrote letters to one another, they also wrote letters to one another. And the author says that, they were wholly Islamic in the openings and in the content. And for the Muslims in Brazil, the author mentions that how the Mina Muslims secretly corresponded with other Muslims in the area. And she says, or in nearby areas, she says that because of their literacy in Arabic, the Muslims were able to keep in touch with co-religionists hundreds of miles away. And she says this is another indication that the Islamic networks were widespread and tightly knit. So in addition to letters, the author also mentions manuscripts that were written by Muslim slaves. And she mentions 3 manuscripts specifically that are still existing. The first one was written in 1817 by Muhammadu Aishatu of Trinidad. And he wrote his manuscript in Hausa using Arabic script, as well as including Pular, Mandinka, and Caribbean Creole words and phrases. And she says, quote, the text contains admonitions to follow the Sharia, the Sunnah, the truth, and the 5 pillars of Islam. The second manuscript she mentions was written in 1823 by Mohammed Kaba Sakanuka of Jamaica. And his family actually taught students from as early as the 14th century. She says after his pseudo-conversion to Christianity, which we talked about before, where they would be outwardly Christian but wholly Muslim inside, he wrote a 50-page document that she says addressed she's quoting him, community of Muslim men and women, and enjoining them to think, again quoting him, about the matter of this world and how this world must be for submission to Allah. The third manuscript, collected in 1855, is a 6-page document written in Arabic by Sanasi of Panama. The author says it contains several surahs and arad, or supplications, and she says, quote, one passage focuses on the significance of the written word of the Quran and affirmation of the importance of literacy. She said all of these men wrote as Muslims, writing for the benefit of others and making, quote, serious efforts to keep the community on the right path, at maintaining orthodoxy, and at extolling the value of education, literacy, self-discipline, and solidarity. MashaAllah. Now, a literary genre common more in the United States, the author says, was the slave narratives, which were autobiographies or partial autobiographies. And she focuses on the testimonies of what she calls true Africans, so I'm assuming she means first generation. And she mentions 10, of which 5 were born and raised Muslim, including Ibrahim Abdurrahman, who wrote his in 1828, Omar ibn Said in 1831, Abu Bakr as-Siddiq in 1834, Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa in 1854, and Muhammad Ali bin Said in 1867. And the author says that Omar ibn Said and Abu Bakr as-Siddiq both wrote their biographies in Arabic. By writing in Arabic, she says, it helped to keep it unaltered. Both focused their attention on their Islamic education and in their biographies by focusing on the tenets of Islam. And as we mentioned before, Omar ibn Said opens his biography with Surat al-Mulk, right? And this, the author says, he wrote to show that, quoting her, it is God, not Omar's owner, who has the power, mashallah. So I'd like to end with this quote from the author. A long tradition of literacy, which in some parts of West Africa was already 500 years old at the beginning of the slave trade, could not be erased, even in the most intellectually damaging environment. SubhanAllah. So we will end the live stream there, and inshallah, open it up for discussion. Jazakallah khair for joining us.